I caught HOA bulldozing my fence while I was at work. Now they're rebuilding it in stone. The alert hit my phone at 2:23 p.m. on a Thursday. I was standing in the basement of a half-finished medical complex on Route 9, arguing with a plumber about pipe diameter violations, when my security app started screaming. Motion detected. Multiple subjects. Eastern perimeter. I stepped away from the argument, told the contractor to hold that thought, and pulled up the live feed. What I saw made my blood turn to ice water. A yellow bulldozer was pushing through my fence, not nudging it, not accidentally clipping it, systematically destroying it. Cedar posts I'd driven into that ground with my own hands were snapping like toothpicks, flying into the air, disappearing under steel treads. Two men in hard hats stood nearby, one taking photographs like he was documenting a crime scene, the other directing the driver with hand signals like this was just another Tuesday demolition job. On the door of the bulldozer, a logo I recognized from neighborhood newsletters I usually threw away. Ridgewood Estates, HOA, Property Standards Division. My hands were shaking as I called the number I had saved for the HOA office. A woman answered. Bored, professional, the voice of someone who spent her days deflecting complaints. Ridgewood Estates, how can I help you? This is Frank Kowalski, 2847 Oak Valley Road. There's a bulldozer tearing down my fence right now. I'm watching it happen on camera. What the hell is going on? Silence. The sound of papers shuffling. Then a different voice. Male, smooth as polished stone. The kind of voice that belongs to men who've never done an honest day's labor in their lives. Mr. Kowalski, this is Greg Patterson, community manager. I apologize for any confusion, but what you're seeing is a sanctioned remediation of a non-compliant structure. Your fence was determined to be in violation of the updated community setback requirements. We're installing an approved stone boundary wall in accordance with the new aesthetic standards. Updated requirements? That fence has been standing for 9 years. On my property, 3 feet inside my property line. I have the survey to prove it. According to our surveyor's recent findings, the fence actually encroaches on the community easement zone. The new wall will correct this long-standing error and bring your property into full compliance. His voice dripped with false sympathy. You should be thanking us, really. Stone adds considerably more value than weathered cedar. Think of it as a free upgrade. I want to see the survey. I want to see the authorization. I want to know who approved this and when. All documentation is available at the HOA office during regular business hours. Monday through Friday, 9 to 4. We'd be happy to schedule an appointment for next week to discuss any concerns you might have. Have a pleasant afternoon, Mr. Kowalski. The line went dead. I stood there in that basement, phone in my hand, watching the live feed as the bulldozer made another pass. The fence was almost gone now. Just a few posts left standing in the far corner, a pathetic remnant of what had been there that morning. One of those posts was different from the others, thicker, darker. The corner post that Tyler and I had set together 9 years ago, the weekend before he shipped out to Afghanistan. I watched the bulldozer blade catch it at the base. It resisted for a moment, stubborn like the boy who'd helped plant it, and then it fell. I was in my truck before I realized I was moving. The drive from the medical complex to my property takes 35 minutes on a good day, following the speed limits, stopping at lights like a reasonable person. I made it in 19. I don't remember the speed limit or the traffic or anything except the image of that corner post falling, playing on a loop in my mind like a film I couldn't stop. Tyler was 22 when we built that fence together. He'd just finished his army training at Fort Benning, had his orders, knew he was headed to Kandahar province in a week. He'd come home for one last weekend before deployment, and I'd planned a dozen activities, things fathers are supposed to do with sons they might never see again. But Tyler had looked at the old chicken wire fence along the property line, rusted and sagging after 15 years, and said, "Dad, let's build something that'll last. So we did. We spent that whole weekend working on the fence, just the two of us. His mother had died 3 years earlier, breast cancer, and it was just us in that house now. Father and son, learning how to be a family of two, learning how to fill the silence she'd left behind. I remember him driving the posts while I held them steady, the solid thunk of the post driver echoing across the yard. Remember the way he'd wipe sweat off his forehead with the back of his glove, the same gesture I'd always used, genetics asserting themselves in small moments. Remember sitting on the tailgate of my truck at sunset, drinking beers I'd technically have to overlook since he wasn't quite 21, talking about everything and nothing. He'd told me about his training, about the friends he'd made, about the sergeant who'd pushed him harder than anyone ever had. He'd told me about the guys in his unit, Martinez from Texas, who could fix anything mechanical, Johnson from Ohio, who told terrible jokes but made everyone laugh anyway, Patel from New Jersey, who was sending half his pay home to his parents. He'd told me he wasn't scared of deployment, which I knew was a lie, but appreciated anyway because it meant he was trying to protect me from worrying. He'd told me about a girl he'd met at a bar near the base, a nursing student with red hair and a laugh that made him forget where he was. He'd shown me her picture on his phone, asked if I thought she was too pretty for him. I'd told him no woman was too pretty for a Kowalski man, and he'd rolled his eyes the way he always did when I said something embarrassingly fatherly. He'd told me he was proud to serve, proud to follow in the footsteps of his grandfather who'd fought in Korea and his great-uncle who'd landed at Normandy. Told me that when he signed up, he'd felt like he was joining something bigger than himself, something that mattered. Told me that even knowing the risks, he'd do it again. And then, as the stars came out and the beers ran low and the mosquitoes started their evening patrol, he'd looked at the fence we'd built and smiled. That smile was so like his mother's smile that it hit me like a punch to the chest. Ellen had been gone 3 years, but sometimes I still saw her in every expression Tyler made. "This fence is going to be here when I get back," he'd said. "Something to come home to. Something we built together." I'd put my hand on his shoulder and squeezed, not trusting my voice. "It'll be here," I'd managed finally. "I promise." He never came back. IED on a routine patrol, 7 months into his deployment. A road they'd driven 100 times, checking on a village they'd helped rebuild. The chaplain who delivered the news said Tyler had been in the lead vehicle, that he'd volunteered for lead because it was the most dangerous position, that he'd probably never known what hit him. I don't know if that's true. I don't know if they tell every parent that their child didn't suffer, whether it's true or not. I don't know if Tyler had time to be scared, to think of home, to think of me. They gave me a flag and a medal and a box of personal effects that still sits unopened in my closet because I can't bear to see what was in his pockets when he died. They gave me grief counseling and survivor benefits and the phone number of a support group I never called. They gave me condolence letters from his commanding officer, from his squad mates, from the Secretary of the Army. Martinez from Texas wrote me separately, a handwritten letter that took me 3 tries to finish reading. He said Tyler had been the best of them. Said Tyler had taught him how to play chess during the long nights between patrols. Said Tyler had saved his life once, pulling him into cover during an ambush, and never mentioned it again because that's the kind of man he was. The red-haired nursing student came to the funeral. I didn't know who she was until afterward, when she introduced herself through tears. They'd only known each other for a few months, but she said Tyler had changed her life, said he'd made her believe that good men still existed. She sends me a card every year on the anniversary of his death. What none of them could give me was my son, but I had the fence. Every morning for 9 years, I'd look out my kitchen window and see those cedar posts standing straight and strong. And I'd think of Tyler, think of that weekend, think of him wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his glove, think of him saying, "Something to come home to." Now the fence was gone, and with it, the last thing my son had built with his own hands. I pulled into the driveway and stopped the truck. For a long moment, I just sat there, hands still on the wheel, staring at the destruction through my windshield. The fence was completely gone. In its place was churned earth, deep tire tracks, scattered wood chips, and a raw wound where our work had stood for 9 years. A crew of workers was already setting up forms for a concrete foundation, laying the groundwork for whatever stone monstrosity they planned to replace it with. They worked efficiently, professionally, like men who'd done this exact thing many times before. And the foundation line was wrong, not where our fence had been. At least 8 feet closer to my house, carving a chunk out of my property as casually as slicing a piece from a cake. I got out of the truck and walked to where the corner post had stood. The wood was still there, broken, splintered, ground into the dirt by the bulldozer's treads. Mixed with the splinters were pieces of the wild roses Tyler's mother had planted along the fence line years ago. Crushed flat, their red petals scattered like drops of blood. I knelt down and picked up a piece of the post. The grain was still visible, still tight and strong, the heartwood that would have resisted rot for another 50 years if they'd let it stand. Cedar doesn't give up easily. Neither did my son. On one side of the fragment, I found it. Carved letters, rough and crooked, the work of a pocket knife in inexperienced hands. TK-16, Tyler Kowalski, the year he shipped out. The year everything changed. I held that piece of wood like it was a piece of my son. Because in a way, it was. The crew foreman walked over, clipboard in hand, hard hat pushed back on his head. He had the look of a man who just wanted to do his job and go home, not get involved in whatever drama his employers had created. You the homeowner? I am. We got orders to have the foundation poured by end of week, stone delivery Monday. Wall should be done in 2 weeks, weather permitting. He glanced at his clipboard. You'll get a notice about the assessment. Payment plans available if needed. That foundation line is 8 feet inside my property. He shrugged, not meeting my eyes. I just build what they tell me to build. HOA's got the survey that says this is the new boundary. You got a problem. Take it up with them. What's your name? He hesitated. Mike. Mike Durrant. Mike, do you know what used to be here? What you just destroyed? He shifted uncomfortably. Look, man, I'm just doing my job. I don't know anything about... My son and I built this fence together 9 years ago, the weekend before he deployed to Afghanistan. I held up the piece of wood with Tyler's initials. He died over there. This fence was the last thing he ever built. Mike's face changed. Something flickered in his eyes that might have been shame. He looked at the carved initials, then at me, then down at the ground. I didn't know, he said quietly. They just told us it was a non-compliant structure. Didn't say anything about... He trailed off. You have kids, Mike. 2 boys, 7 and 9. Imagine them growing up. Imagine one of them going off to war. Imagine getting that phone call, the one every parent fears. I stood up slowly, the fragment of wood still in my hand. And then imagine someone coming along and bulldozing the last thing you had left of them. Mike didn't say anything. He just stood there, clipboard forgotten at his side, looking like a man who wished he'd called in sick that morning. I walked back to my truck. I should have argued with him, should have demanded they stop, should have called the police right then and there. But what would be the point? The fence was already gone. The damage was already done. Instead, I drove home, walked into my bedroom, and placed the wood fragment on my dresser next to Tyler's folded flag and his Bronze Star medal. Then I sat on the edge of my bed and stared at those 3 objects for a long time. A flag, a medal, a piece of wood with crooked initials. That's all that was left of my son. I don't know how long I sat there. Long enough for the sun to go down. Long enough for the room to fill with shadows. Long enough for the anger to move from my chest to my bones, settling in deep, becoming part of me. They had no idea who they were dealing with. I'm a building inspector, have been for 23 years. I know every code in the county book. I know every trick contractors use to cut corners, every lie developers tell to push through permits, every bureaucratic pathway that projects have to navigate before a single shovel hits dirt. If Greg Patterson and his HOA thought they could bulldoze a veterans memorial and get away with it, they had badly underestimated who they were dealing with. I stood up, walked to my home office, and started planning. The next morning, I didn't go to the HOA office. I didn't file a complaint. I didn't call a lawyer. I went to work, not my regular inspection route. I called in and told my supervisor I needed to swap assignments for the day, deal with something personal. Ray Martinez, who'd been covering the county records beat for 30 years, was happy to let me take his shift. He was 2 years from retirement and hated the paperwork side of the job anyway. As a building inspector, I had access to files that regular citizens couldn't touch: permit histories, developer applications, environmental impact assessments, zoning variance requests, the paper trail that every construction project leaves behind. I spent the morning in the county records office, pulling files, making copies, building a picture of what was really happening in my neighborhood. I started with Ridgewood Estates, HOA, pulled their corporate filings, their board meeting minutes, their architectural review committee records. 4 hours of reading through dry bureaucratic language, and a pattern started to emerge. Greg Patterson had been community manager for 3 years. In that time, the HOA had assessed more emergency repairs and community improvements than in the previous decade combined. Homeowners were hit with special assessments averaging $15,000 to $40,000 each, sometimes more. Those who couldn't pay faced liens on their properties. Those who complained found themselves buried under violation notices for everything from grass height to mailbox color to the angle of their basketball hoops. 17 families had sold their homes in the past 3 years. All of them had been in conflict with the HOA at the time of sale. All of them had sold below market value, but that wasn't what made my pulse quicken. What caught my attention was a name that kept appearing in the financial records, hidden in line items labeled Consulting Services and Community Development Coordination. Harmon Development Group. Harmon was a mid-sized developer with a reputation for aggressive timelines and minimal community engagement. They built fast, sold fast, moved on to the next project before the complaints about construction defects started rolling in. I'd inspected some of their projects over the years. Nothing outright illegal, but always pushing the edges of code compliance, always looking for shortcuts. And according to the records, they'd been circling my neighborhood for 2 years. I dug deeper, found a planning application from 8 months ago, still working its way through the approval process. Harmon wanted to build a 150-unit townhouse complex on the empty parcel west of Ridgewood Estates. Commercial space on the ground floor, 3 stories of residential above. A $25 million project that would completely transform the area. The application had been approved in principle, subject to conditions. One of those conditions was road access. The main entrance would come off Route 12, but they also needed a secondary access point for construction vehicles. Heavy equipment, concrete trucks, material deliveries, all the traffic that comes with a major construction project. The kind of traffic that would destroy residential streets if routed through the main neighborhood. According to the application, Harmon had proposed a construction easement through the eastern edge of Ridgewood Estates, a 12-foot wide path that would allow their trucks to access the site without tearing up the fancy streets the HOA was so proud of. The proposed path ran directly through my property. I sat back in my chair, staring at the screen, feeling the pieces click together in my head. 8 feet. That's how much of my land they were claiming with their new wall. 8 feet that, combined with existing easement space, would give them exactly the 12-foot construction road they needed. I pulled up the cost estimates from the original application. The alternate route, the one that would go around private property using undeveloped county land, was priced at $800,000. Road grading, drainage infrastructure, temporary surfaces, environmental mitigation, restoration afterward. Nearly $1 million that Harmon didn't want to spend. My fence was worth $1 million to them. Not the wood itself, not the craftsmanship, but the land it protected, the land they needed. And Greg Patterson, the community manager who was supposed to represent homeowners' interests, was the one clearing the path for them. I started pulling financial records. Personal records now, not just corporate. It took some digging, some cross-referencing, some creative database queries that probably bent a few rules. But when you've worked in county government for 23 years, you learn where the information lives and how to find it. Greg Patterson's consulting company, GMP Advisory Services, LLC, had received 3 payments from Harmon Development over the past 18 months. The payments were structured to stay just under the threshold that would trigger automatic reporting. Total, $127,000. All described as community liaison services and stakeholder engagement consulting. Bribery. That's what it was. Plain and simple. Greg Patterson was being paid 6 figures to deliver my land to a developer who wanted to save $800,000 on their construction budget. I copied every document, saved it to a flash drive, made 3 backup copies and stored them in different locations. Then I drove home as the sun was setting, walked to what remained of my fence line, and stood there in the dying light, looking at the foundation forms the construction crew had left behind. They were already mixing concrete, already laying rebar. Building their wall on my son's grave, metaphorically speaking. They picked the wrong father, I said to the empty air, to the ghost of my son, to whatever spirit might be listening. They picked the wrong son to disrespect. The next week was a chess game, and I had been playing chess for 23 years. I didn't fight them directly, didn't file complaints that would disappear into bureaucratic holes, didn't hire lawyers who would bill me by the hour while the other side ran out the clock. Instead, I watched, I documented. I let them build their foundation and start laying their stone wall 8 feet onto my property while I gathered evidence and prepared my counterattack. But I wasn't passive. Not by a long shot. I'm a building inspector. I have colleagues, friends. People who owe me favors accumulated over more than 2 decades of fair dealing and professional courtesy. When you've covered for someone's sick days, helped train their new hires, shared information that made their jobs easier, you build social capital. That capital was about to pay dividends. On Monday, I had coffee with Jim Reeves, the senior fire inspector for the county. We talked about our kids. His daughter was getting married in the spring, and he was stressed about the costs. We talked about the new restaurant that had opened downtown. And then, casually, I mentioned that I'd heard Harmon Development was cutting corners on their new project, and maybe it was worth taking a look. That afternoon, a surprise inspection hit the Harmon Development site. Fire suppression systems. 3 violations found. Insufficient water pressure in the standpipes, blocked access to fire department connections, and missing tamper-proof seals on the sprinkler valves. Work stopped pending corrections. On Wednesday, I ran into Sarah Chen at the county planning office. We'd worked together on a dozen projects over the years, had a mutual respect built on competence and honesty. I showed her some irregularities I'd noticed in the Harmon electrical plans. Just professional curiosity. She pulled the full permit application and found more problems. Insufficient panel capacity for the proposed load. Ambiguous grounding specifications, incomplete load calculations. A stop work order was issued pending a complete electrical redesign. 2 weeks minimum, maybe more if the engineers pushed back. On Friday, I had lunch with Dave Martinez, no relation to Ray, from Environmental Services. We talked about fishing, about the trout season, about a spot up north that nobody else seemed to know about. And then I mentioned, in passing, that I'd noticed the Harmon project was on a property that used to be wetlands, and I wondered if their storm water detention calculations had accounted for the historical water table. They hadn't. Dave's team found that the detention pond was undersized by 40%. A new engineering study was required, along with revised plans and another round of public comment. Each delay cost Harmon money. Each delay pushed back their timeline. Each delay made them more desperate to get that construction easement operational, to start moving equipment to show their investors that progress was being made. And each delay was completely legitimate. Every violation was real. Every concern was well-founded. I wasn't sabotaging anything. I was just making sure the right people were looking in the right places at the right times. The kind of careful scrutiny that any project should receive, but that somehow never gets applied to developers with political connections and deep pockets. Word got around the inspection office quickly. Everyone knew what Patterson and the HOA had done to my fence. Everyone knew about Tyler. His photo still hung in the break room, part of a memorial wall for employees who'd lost family members in military service. And everyone, without discussing it explicitly, without leaving any paper trail that could be traced, found reasons to look a little harder at anything connected to Harmon development. That's the thing about 23 years of doing a job right. You build trust. You build relationships, and when someone comes after one of your own, the whole network responds. Meanwhile, the wall on my property kept growing, 8 feet tall now, decorative capstones being placed, looking more and more permanent every day. The masons worked with professional efficiency, laying stone after stone, not knowing or not caring that they were building on stolen ground. Every evening, I'd walk to the property line and look at it. This monument to corruption built on land my son and I had worked together. I'd stand exactly where Tyler and I had stood that last weekend, where we'd driven the corner post, where he'd carved his initials with shaking hands because he was nervous about the deployment he wouldn't admit to being nervous about. The wall was beautiful, in a cold way. Italian limestone, precisely cut, mortared with expert care. It would probably stand for 100 years if no one tore it down. And that was exactly what Patterson was counting on, that by the time the legal battles were over, the wall would be so established, so permanent, that removing it would seem more trouble than it was worth. But they didn't know me. Didn't know that I'd spent my whole career spotting shortcuts and holding people accountable. Didn't know that stubbornness runs in my family like blue eyes and high blood pressure. While the inspection network was slowing down Harmon's project, Patterson started pushing back against me directly. The HOA machinery cranked into high gear. Day 3 after the fence came down, a notice on my door citing my mailbox as non-compliant with community aesthetic standards. The mailbox had been in the same spot for 22 years. Day 5. My truck was ticketed for improper overnight parking in my own driveway. The citation was from a private security company I'd never heard of, operating under contract with the HOA. Day 8. A letter informing me that my property was being assessed $12,000 for emergency infrastructure repair related to a water main break 3 streets away from my house. Day 12. Code enforcement showed up citing an anonymous complaint about excessive noise from my workshop. I hadn't used the workshop in 2 weeks. Day 15. A notice that my homeowner's insurance policy was being reviewed after an inquiry about structural concerns on my property. Nobody would tell me who made the inquiry. Each attack was designed to be just annoying enough to wear me down, just official-looking enough to require a response, just expensive enough in time and money to make giving up seem attractive. Death by 1,000 cuts. The same playbook they'd used on 17 other families, but I wasn't other families. I documented every notice, every citation, every letter. filed responses that were technically correct but obviously dismissive. Let them waste their resources on harassment while I built my case. I knew the delays wouldn't last forever. Harmon had lawyers, lobbyists, connections in the state capitol. They'd start pushing back, asking why their project was getting special scrutiny, threatening lawsuits and political pressure. The inspection network was buying me time, but time is a finite resource. I needed something more permanent. I needed proof that would hold up in court. I needed to expose Greg Patterson in a way that couldn't be spun, couldn't be denied, couldn't be buried. The proof came from an unexpected source. I was at home on Thursday evening, 2 weeks after the bulldozer had destroyed my fence, going through the documents I'd copied from the county records, organizing them, looking for connections I might have missed, preparing for a fight I knew was coming. There was a knock at my door. Not a confident knock, not an official knock. Hesitant, almost apologetic, like whoever was on the other side wasn't sure they wanted to be there. I opened it to find a woman in her 30s, brown hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, wearing the kind of clothes you see on people who work in offices but don't particularly care about fashion. She looked nervous. Her eyes kept darting to the street behind her, like she was checking to make sure she hadn't been followed. "Mr. Kowalski, my name's Rachel Vance. I'm Greg Patterson's assistant at the HOA office." I didn't invite her in, didn't move from the doorway. "What do you want?" "I want to help you." She glanced around again, that nervous check of the surroundings. "I've been watching what they're doing to you, what they've done to other people, and I can't be part of it anymore. I studied her face, looking for tells, trying to decide if this was genuine or a setup. She could be exactly what she appeared, a guilty conscience looking for absolution. Or she could be a plant, sent by Patterson to find out what I knew and how I was fighting back. "Why should I trust you?" "Because I have this." She pulled a flash drive from her jacket pocket, standard black plastic, the kind you can buy in any office supply store. Emails between Greg and Marcus Harmon, the CEO of Harmon Development. Not the sanitized versions they filed with the county, the real conversations. Payment schedules, timelines, strategy discussions, the whole conspiracy spelled out in their own words. "Why give this to me?" Rachel's eyes met mine, and I saw something there that I recognized. Anger. Not the hot, explosive kind, but the cold, patient kind. The specific kind of anger that comes from watching injustice happen day after day and being powerless to stop it. "My father was a veteran," she said quietly. "Marines. 2 tours in Iraq. He died at the VA hospital 3 years ago, complications from a traumatic brain injury he'd suffered in Fallujah. Took 12 years for it to finally kill him." She paused, gathering herself. "When I heard what they did to your fence, when I heard about your son, when I realized they'd bulldozed a memorial to a fallen soldier so a developer could save money on road construction," her voice hardened. "I couldn't look at myself in the mirror anymore. Couldn't keep filing Greg's paperwork like it was normal, like it was okay, like we weren't destroying people's lives for profit." I stepped aside. "Come in." She did. We sat at my kitchen table, cups of coffee between us that neither of us drank, and she laid out everything she knew. The conspiracy was bigger than I'd realized. Greg Patterson wasn't just taking bribes from Harmon. He was running a systematic operation to identify properties that stood in the way of development projects and use his HOA authority to pressure owners into selling. The stone wall on my property wasn't just about the easement. Once it was built, once the corrected boundary was established as fact on the ground, my property value would drop. My usable land would shrink. My home would become less desirable to potential buyers. And then a buyer, specifically a buyer working through a shell company controlled by Harmon, would show up with a lowball offer that suddenly seemed reasonable compared to years of fighting the HOA in court. They'd done it before. 3 other families in Ridgewood Estates had sold in the past 2 years after similar boundary corrections. All 3 properties had been quietly absorbed into Harmon's development footprint. All 3 families had taken losses of 30 to 50% compared to what their homes should have been worth. "I made copies of everything," Rachel said, sliding the flash drive across the table. "Emails, payment records, internal memos, recorded phone calls. Greg doesn't know I know his password, but he's not exactly a technical genius. It's his wife's birthday, followed by 1, 2, 3. I looked at the small piece of plastic sitting on my kitchen table. It contained everything I needed to destroy Greg Patterson. Everything I needed to protect my land. Everything I needed to get justice for Tyler's fence. "Why not go to the police yourself?" I asked. "Because I'm nobody. I'm a secretary with a community college degree, a failed marriage, and an apartment I can barely afford." Greg has lawyers, connections, the HOA board in his pocket. Half the county commissioners play golf at the Ridgewood Club. If I come forward alone, they'll bury me. They'll claim I'm a disgruntled employee, fabricating evidence for a wrongful termination lawsuit, whatever story works. She leaned forward, intensity in her eyes. "But you're different. You're a county building inspector with 23 years of service and a spotless record. You have credibility in this community. You have connections of your own, and you have a story that will make people angry on your behalf. A veteran's father, a son who died in Afghanistan, a memorial fence bulldozed by a corrupt HOA working for a greedy developer." She was right. A secretary with stolen files could be dismissed. A veteran's father, a county inspector, a man whose son's memorial was destroyed for developer profits. That was a story that would lead the evening news. "There's one more thing," Rachel said. "I know when they're planning to formally file the boundary change with the county. Next Wednesday. Once that's filed and certified, once it goes into the official records, the legal battle becomes 10 times harder. The wall becomes the presumptive boundary. You'd have to prove it was built on your land, rather than them proving they had the right to build it. How long do I have? 6 days. 6 days to take down Greg Patterson. 6 days to expose Harmon Development. 6 days to save my son's fence." I looked at the flash drive again, then at Rachel. "Thank you," I said. "You're taking a real risk here. If Patterson finds out you did this, let him find out." Her voice was steady now, resolved. "I'm done being afraid of men like him. Men who think they can do whatever they want because they have money and connections and everyone else is too scared to fight back." She stood up to leave. At the door, she paused and looked back at me. "Mr. Kowalski, make them pay. For my father, for your son, for all the families they've destroyed. Make them pay for everything." After she left, I sat at my kitchen table for a long time, looking at the flash drive, thinking about what came next. The bureaucratic war had bought me time. Rachel's evidence had given me ammunition. Now I needed a battlefield. I needed to go public, and I needed to do it in a way that Patterson couldn't spin, couldn't deny, couldn't hide from. I picked up my phone and made a call. Channel 5. News, how may I direct your call? "I have a story for you. HOA corruption, developer bribes, and a veteran's memorial destroyed for profit. I have documents, recordings, and witnesses. Are you interested?" There was a pause. Then, "Hold please, let me transfer you to our investigative unit." The segment came together faster than I expected. Channel 5's investigative team was led by a producer named Mark Torres, a former newspaper reporter who'd won multiple awards for his corruption exposés. When I showed him Rachel's files, when I played him the recordings of Greg Patterson and Marcus Harmon discussing their scheme in explicit detail, his eyes lit up like a kid on Christmas morning. "This is solid," he said, flipping through printed emails. "Payments, timelines, explicit discussion of boundary manipulation. They didn't even try to be subtle about it. These morons put everything in writing. They thought they were untouchable, I said. They thought nobody would ever see this. That's usually when people get sloppy. When they've been getting away with it so long, they forget to be careful. He looked up at me. I want to do more than a news segment. I want a full investigation, multiple sources, documented evidence, expert analysis. Something that can't be dismissed as a hit piece or a personal vendetta. How long? 3 days. We'll interview you. Get footage of the wall they're building on your property. Talk to the other families they've done this to. I've got a forensic accountant who can trace the money flows. I've got a real estate lawyer who can explain exactly how illegal this is. He paused. And I want to confront Patterson on camera. That last part, I said. I want to be there for. Mark smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was the smile of a man who enjoyed watching corrupt people squirm, who'd built his career on that exact pleasure. I was hoping you'd say that. The next 3 days were a blur of activity. Mark's team interviewed me at my property, filming the stone wall that was still being built on my land, the churned earth where my fence had stood, the corner where Tyler and I had set that first post 9 years ago. I showed them the fragment of wood with Tyler's carved initials. I showed them his flag, his medal, the photo of us together at his army graduation. They interviewed Helen Marchetti, whose property had been corrected 2 years ago. A widow in her 60s, she'd fought the HOA for 8 months before finally selling at a loss and moving to a rental apartment across town. On camera, she cried when she talked about the home where she'd raised her children, the garden her late husband had planted, the memories that had been stolen from her. They interviewed Robert Chen, a software engineer whose family had lived in Ridgewood Estates for a decade before the HOA came for their property. He'd hired 3 lawyers, spent $40,000 on legal fees, fought for 18 months before finally accepting a buyout from Harmon. His interview was quieter, more bitter. They just wear you down, he said. Death by 1,000 cuts. You can't fight people who have unlimited time and money to make your life miserable. They traced the money. Mark's forensic accountant found the shell companies Patterson had used to hide the payments from Harmon, found the accounts where he'd stashed his cut, found emails where he bragged to his girlfriend about the consulting gig that would let him retire to Florida by 55. And they got something I hadn't expected, a former Harmon executive who'd left the company 6 months ago and was willing to talk on background. He confirmed everything. The boundary manipulation scheme, the HOA partnerships, the systematic acquisition of properties standing in the way of development projects. They called it creative land assembly, he said, like it was just a business strategy instead of organized theft. By Tuesday night, Mark had enough for a full expose. 20 minutes of television that would destroy Greg Patterson, embarrass Harmon Development, and force the county to investigate. But I wanted more than that. I wanted Patterson to face me, to look at me while his world collapsed around him, to feel some fraction of what I'd felt watching that bulldozer destroy my son's fence. Tomorrow morning, Mark said. We show up at the HOA office, cameras rolling, and ask Patterson to respond to the evidence. If he runs, that's a story. If he fights, that's a story. If he breaks down and confesses, that's an even better story. And if he attacks us? Mark shrugged, a gleam in his eye. Then that's the best story of all. Wednesday morning, 9 a.m., the day Greg Patterson was supposed to file his fraudulent boundary change with the county. Instead, he was about to face the cameras. We rolled up to the HOA office with 2 news vans, a full camera crew, and 3 other homeowners who'd agreed to come forward. Helen Marchetti, Robert Chen, the Delacroix family, who'd lost their property a year ago and never recovered financially. I walked in first. The receptionist, a young woman I didn't recognize, looked up with a customer service smile that faltered when she saw the cameras behind me. "I need to see Greg Patterson," I said. "Now." "Mr. Patterson is in a meeting." His meeting just got interrupted. I walked past her desk toward the office I knew was Patterson's. She sputtered protests, reached for her phone, but Mark's cameraman was already filming and she froze, unsure what to do. Patterson's door was closed. I didn't knock, just turned the handle and walked in. He was sitting behind his desk, leather chair, expensive suit, phone to his ear, the very picture of small-time bureaucratic self-importance. When he saw me, his face went through a rapid series of expressions: annoyance at the interruption, confusion at the camera behind me, recognition of who I was, and finally something that looked almost like fear. "I'll call you back," he said into the phone and hung up. "Mr. Kowalski, you can't just barge into... You destroyed my fence," I said. My voice was calm, steady, the voice I used when I was writing up contractors for code violations, the voice that said I had documentation, I had evidence, and arguing with me would only make things worse. "You bulldozed a memorial to my son, who died serving this country. And you did it because Harmon Development paid you $127,000 to steal my land." Patterson's face went pale. The camera was in the room now, recording everything. His eyes darted to the lens like a trapped animal looking for escape. "I don't know what you're talking about. That fence was in violation of..." "We have your emails." I pulled out printed pages, the ones Rachel had given me. Conversations with Marcus Harmon about the construction easement, payment schedules. Your own words, Greg, talking about removing obstacles and accelerating the timeline and making the Kowalski problem go away. He grabbed for the papers. I pulled them back. "We have your bank records, the shell companies, the accounts where you hid the money. We have testimony from a former Harmon executive. We have 3 families you did this to before me, all willing to go on camera and tell their stories." Patterson stood up, his chair rolling backward and hitting the wall. "This is harassment. This is trespassing. I'm calling the police." "Please do," Mark Torres said from the doorway. "We'd love to get their reaction on camera too. I'm sure they'll be very interested in the evidence of fraud and bribery we've gathered." For a long moment, nobody moved. Patterson looked at me, at the cameras, at the stack of evidence in my hands. I could see the calculation happening behind his eyes, the desperate search for an angle, an escape route, a story that would make this go away. There wasn't one, and slowly, visibly, he realized it. "What do you want?" he asked finally, his voice cracking. "I want you to tear down that wall you're building on my land, with your own hands, on camera. And I want you to resign from the HOA and never work in property management again." "That's insane. I'm not going to..." "Then this airs tonight at 6. Every household in the county will see your face and hear what you've done. And tomorrow, the FBI starts asking questions about wire fraud and conspiracy across state lines." I stepped closer to him, close enough to see the sweat beading on his forehead, close enough to smell the fear coming off him like cheap cologne. "My son built that fence with me, the weekend before he shipped out to Afghanistan. He said it would be something to come home to." My voice stayed level, controlled, but something in my eyes must have changed because Patterson took a step back and hit the wall behind him. "He never came home. He died in Kandahar, killed by an IED while protecting people he'd never met. And you bulldozed the last thing he built with his own hands so a developer could save money on road construction." Patterson's mouth opened and closed. No words came out. "So here's what's going to happen. You're going to come to my property. You're going to pick up the stones your crew laid down, every one of them, and you're going to carry them off my land, one by one, while the cameras record everything. You're going to feel what it's like to work with your hands, to sweat, to strain, to build something instead of destroying it. you're going to feel a tiny fraction of what my son felt when he served his country. That wall weighs tons. The stones alone, I can't possibly. Then you'd better start early. The next 3 days were the most satisfying of my life. Greg Patterson, former community manager, former big shot, former untouchable bureaucrat, showed up at my property at 7 a.m. Thursday morning. He'd traded his expensive suit for work clothes that still had the tags on them, purchased the night before at a big box store. His hands, soft from years of desk work, weren't going to stay soft for long. The cameras were waiting. So were about 50 neighbors who'd heard what was happening and come to watch justice being served. Patterson started with the capstones. Smaller blocks, maybe 40 pounds each, decorative pieces that the masons had positioned with care. He struggled to lift them, his office soft muscles straining, his breathing heavy after just a few trips to the growing pile at the edge of the property. The cameras recorded every grunt, every stumble, every time he had to stop and rest with his hands on his knees. Recorded the sweat staining his new work shirt. Recorded the blisters forming on his palms after just an hour of labor. By noon, he'd moved maybe 1/10 of the wall. His hands were raw, his back was aching, and he'd discovered something that anyone who's done real labor knows. Carrying weight is one thing. Carrying weight over and over, hundreds of times with no break and no end in sight, is something else entirely. I sat on my porch and watched. I didn't gloat, didn't taunt him, didn't offer commentary for the cameras. Just watched, drinking coffee, thinking about Tyler, about the weekend we'd built that fence together, about how he'd worked without complaint, drove posts until his shoulders ached, never asked for a break even when I could see he was exhausted. At 2 p.m., Patterson tried to take a lunch break. "I need food," he said. "I need rest. This is cruel and unusual." "You can rest when the wall is gone," I said simply. "Or you can stop, and this airs tonight, and you go to prison instead of just losing your job." He went back to work. By 4 p.m., the crowd had grown to nearly 100 people. Word had spread through the neighborhood, through the county, through social media. Someone had started live streaming the event. Patterson's suffering was being broadcast in real time to thousands of viewers. His hands were bleeding now, the blisters burst and raw. His face was bright red from exertion and humiliation. He'd stopped trying to hide his labored breathing, stopped trying to maintain any dignity. He was just trying to survive. At 5:30 p.m., as the sun was getting low and the shadows were stretching long across the yard, Patterson tried to lift one of the larger foundation stones. Maybe 80 pounds, awkward shape, impossible to get a good grip on. His hands were so raw and bloody that the stone kept slipping, smearing red across the grey limestone. He squatted down, wrapped his arms around it, and tried to stand. His legs trembled, his arms shook. Sweat dripped from his chin onto the stone. He got it off the ground, took one step. The crowd held its breath. 2 steps. His face was purple with effort, veins standing out on his forehead, and then something in his lower back gave way with an audible pop, a wet, organic sound that made everyone in the crowd wince. Patterson dropped the stone. It landed on his foot, and he screamed again, a second scream layered on top of the first. He collapsed sideways, hands clutching his back, his crushed toes forgotten in the blaze of spinal agony. His expensive new work boots, bought just for this occasion, were now deformed around his mangled foot. He lay there in the dirt, writhing, tears streaming down his face, making sounds that weren't quite words. The cameras kept rolling. Every moment of his agony was being broadcast to thousands of viewers who tuned in to watch a corrupt bureaucrat get his comeuppance. Someone in the crowd laughed, then quickly stopped, embarrassed. But the damage was done. That laugh would be in the footage, a punctuation mark on Patterson's humiliation. I stood up from my porch chair and walked over to where he was writhing on the ground, looked down at him. This man who'd thought he was untouchable, this man who'd destroyed my son's memorial for money, now lying in the dirt, unable to move, weeping from pain and shame. His suit pants, he'd worn suit pants under the new work jeans, as if he couldn't fully commit to the manual labor even when his freedom depended on it, were torn at the knee. His shirt was dark with sweat and dirt. His slicked back hair was wild, sticking up in clumps. He looked exactly like what he was, a small man who'd finally been made to answer for his sins. "Looks like you herniated a disc," I said calmly. "That'll take surgery to fix. 6 weeks of recovery, minimum. Physical therapy for months after that. Your back will never be the same." "Help me," he gasped. "Please, call an ambulance." "Of course." I pulled out my phone. "But first I want you to say it, on camera, what you did. Why you did it, all of it." "I can't, the pain." "The ambulance will come faster if you cooperate." He looked up at me with hatred in his eyes. But he also saw something in my face that told him I wasn't bluffing, that I would stand here and watch him suffer until he gave me what I wanted. "Fine," he gasped. "Fine. I took money from Harmon to clear properties for their development. I forged the boundary documents. I ordered the fence destroyed. All of it." "Is that what you want to hear?" "Yes," I said. "That's exactly what I wanted to hear." I called the ambulance. They arrived in 12 minutes. EMTs loaded Patterson onto a stretcher while he moaned about his spine, his disc, his ruined back. The crowd watched in silence. Nobody offered sympathy. Nobody said a word of comfort. As they wheeled him past me, Patterson managed to turn his head. His face was twisted with pain and something darker. Humiliation. Defeat. "This isn't over," he hissed through clenched teeth. "I'll sue you for what?" I asked calmly. "You agreed to this, on camera, in front of witnesses. You chose to move those stones yourself rather than face the evidence we'd gathered. That was your decision, Greg. All I did was give you options." They loaded him into the ambulance and drove away, sirens fading into the evening. He'd spend 8 weeks in physical therapy. His back would never fully recover. And neither would his life. The fallout came fast and hard. The next day, the county sheriff showed up at Patterson's hospital room with an arrest warrant. Wire fraud, conspiracy to commit property theft, filing false documents with county agencies, bribery of a public official. The evidence Rachel had provided was more than enough for charges. The confession Patterson had made on camera, broadcast live to thousands of viewers, was more than enough for conviction. Patterson's lawyer tried to negotiate a plea deal. The DA wasn't interested. This case had become too public, too symbolic, too politically valuable. The county needed to show that corruption wouldn't be tolerated, that ordinary citizens couldn't be bulldozed by developers and their bought and paid for accomplices. A week later, Marcus Harmon and 2 other Harmon development executives were indicted on federal charges. Their scheme had crossed state lines, involved wire transfers, touched multiple jurisdictions. The FBI had been building a case for months. Rachel's evidence and the public exposure gave them everything they needed to move forward. Harmon tried to fight it at first, hired an army of lawyers, filed motion after motion. But the evidence was overwhelming, and his co-conspirators started flipping one by one, cutting deals, testifying against each other. By the time the trial date approached, Harmon knew he was finished. The final numbers. Greg Patterson, 18 months in federal prison, followed by 3 years supervised release. $95,000 in fines and restitution. Permanently barred from working in property management or real estate. His back injury left him with chronic pain that would follow him the rest of his life. Marcus Harmon. 4 years federal prison, $1.2 million in fines. Harmon Development dissolved assets seized to pay claims from defrauded property owners. The wall, ordered removed at Harmon Development's expense. Total cost, $180,000. The work took 3 weeks, and every stone was hauled away and destroyed, erasing the monument to corruption they'd tried to build on my land. The Ridgewood Estates HOA was dissolved by unanimous vote of the remaining members. In its place, a simple neighborhood association with elected leadership, transparent finances, and a constitutional provision stating that no boundary changes could ever be made without the explicit written consent of affected property owners. The other families got their settlements. Helen Marchetti received enough to buy a small house in a different neighborhood, one without an HOA. Robert Chen moved back to Ridgewood Estates into a house even nicer than the one he'd been forced to sell. The Delacroix family used their money to start a small business, finally getting the fresh start they'd been denied for so long. Rachel Vance wasn't prosecuted for her role in exposing the conspiracy. In fact, she became something of a local hero, profiled in newspapers and invited to speak at community meetings about recognizing and fighting HOA abuse. She started a consulting business, helping homeowners fight predatory practices, and last I heard, she'd helped 37 families challenge illegal boundary changes, winning every single case. And me? I rebuilt the fence. It took longer than I expected, partly because I wanted to do it right, partly because I kept stopping to remember. Every post I drove into the ground brought back echoes of that weekend with Tyler. Every board I nailed reminded me of his voice, his laugh, the way he'd argue about the best angle for the fence slats, until I finally told him there was no best angle, just the angle we chose. Cedar posts, same as before. I sourced them from the same lumber yard we'd used 9 years ago, made sure they were cut from the same old-growth stock, dense and straight and built to last. Copper caps on top, because Tyler always said copper looked better than zinced. He'd read somewhere that copper develops a patina over time, that it changes color as it ages, that it becomes more itself with every passing year. I used the same post holes where possible, refilled and tamped the ones the bulldozer had destroyed. The corner post hole, the one Tyler had dug himself while I supervised and criticized and eventually admitted he'd done it perfectly, took me an hour to prepare. I wanted to get it exactly right. I wanted that post to stand exactly where the original had stood, to mark exactly the same spot Tyler and I had marked together. I worked alone for the first few days, wanting the solitude, wanting to feel the connection to the work Tyler and I had done together. Sometimes I'd talk to him while I worked, telling him about the case, about Patterson's humiliation, about the justice that had finally been served. I don't know if the dead can hear us. I hope they can. I hope Tyler knows that I kept my promise, that his fence is standing again, that the people who tried to destroy it paid for what they did. But word spread, and people started showing up to help. Neighbors I'd known for years, people I'd never met who'd seen the story on the news, veterans who'd heard about Tyler and wanted to honor his memory. Danny Chen came on the second weekend. Robert Chen's nephew, 19 years old, just enlisted in the Marines, shipping out to Camp Pendleton in 2 months. He reminded me of Tyler in ways that hurt and healed at the same time, the same serious expression when he was focused on a task, the same quiet determination, the same slight awkwardness of a young man not quite comfortable in his adult body yet. We worked in comfortable silence mostly, the kind of silence men share when words aren't necessary, when the work says everything that needs saying. On the last day, when the final board was nailed and the corner post was standing straight and true, I pulled out my pocket knife. "Your uncle said you're good with a blade," I told Danny. "You want to add something?" He looked at the post, then at me, then back at the post. He understood without me explaining. Carefully, he carved his initials into the wood. DC 25. Right below the spot where I'd already carved TK16 again, restoring what the bulldozer had destroyed. "For the ones who serve," I said. Danny nodded, his young face serious. for the ones who don't come back. We stood there for a while, looking at the fence, looking at the initials, looking at something larger than wood and nails and property lines, looking at memory, looking at sacrifice, looking at the things that endure. 6 months after the trial ended, I was sitting on my porch on a fall evening when an old pickup truck pulled into my driveway. A man got out, mid-60s, wearing work clothes that had seen real work, boots that had walked real miles. He walked up to my porch, stopped at the bottom of the steps, and looked at me with eyes that had seen things I could probably understand. "Mr. Kowalski, my name's James Patterson, Greg's father." I tensed. My hand moved toward the door, where my phone sat, where I could call for help if needed. The old man saw my reaction and raised his hands, palms out. "I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm not here to defend what he did. I'm here to apologize." I said nothing, just waited. What my son did to you, to your property, to your boy's memory. He shook his head slowly, like the weight of it was physical, like he was carrying a stone of his own. I raised him better than that, or I thought I did. I don't know where I went wrong. I've been asking myself that question every day since the news broke. Why are you telling me this? James Patterson looked at the fence, really looked at it, the way you look at something you're trying to understand. "I was in Vietnam, Army Infantry, 3 tours, 68 to 71. Some of the worst of it." He paused. "When I came back, my father helped me build a barn on his property. Just the 2 of us, working through a whole summer. That barn was the first thing I built after the war. The first thing that felt real, felt mine, felt like I was home again and not still stuck in some jungle on the other side of the world." He met my eyes. "I understand what that fence means to you, and I wanted you to know that not everyone in my family is like Greg. Some of us remember what sacrifice means. Some of us remember what it costs." We stood there in silence for a long moment. The evening light was fading, turning everything gold and soft. "Would you like some coffee?" I heard myself ask. He looked surprised. Then he nodded slowly. "I'd like that." "Thank you." We sat on the porch and drank coffee and talked about wars and sons and the things men build with their hands. He told me about his barn, still standing after 50 years. I told him about Tyler, about the weekend we built the fence, about the boy who never came home. When he left, he shook my hand. A firm grip, the grip of a man who'd done hard work all his life. "For what it's worth," he said, "I'm glad you won. My son needed to face consequences. He never learned that growing up, and that's on me. That's my failure as a father." I watched him drive away, his taillights disappearing into the dusk. Then I turned and looked at the fence, the new posts standing straight against the darkening sky. Tyler's initials caught the last light of day, carved fresh and deep. TK-16, a young man's mark on the world, made the weekend before he went to war. I raised my coffee cup in a silent toast. "Something to come home to," I said. "It's still here, son. I kept my promise. It's still here." The fence stood solid and straight against the stars. That's how it's going to stay.